Winter arrived earlier than usual that year, not with the gentle, quiet snowfall that turns neighborhoods into postcards, but with an aggressive storm system that seemed intent on testing every weakness in our town's infrastructure and every ounce of patience in its residents. And for me, that storm marked the beginning of a conflict I never imagined would escalate into something the entire homeowners association later wished they could erase from memory because my property sat at the lowest edge of the neighborhood, just beyond the neatly plowed HOA maintained streets. A small private parcel I owned outright and maintained myself, separate from their rules, their fees, and their authority. And that distinction mattered far more than they ever wanted to admit. The first major snowfall dumped nearly 2 feet of dense wet snow overnight, the kind that bends tree branches and stalls traffic, and by morning, I could hear the familiar sounds of plows scraping asphalt and backup alarms echoing through the cold air. But instead of watching snow being responsibly removed and hauled away, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten as I looked out over my land. Truck after truck was pushing massive walls of snow straight off the HOA street and dumping it onto my property like it was an unclaimed landfill. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe a rushed driver trying to clear the road quickly. But when I walked out and confronted the crew leader, bundled in reflective gear and clearly uninterested in conversation, he shrugged and said, "HOA told us this side was fine," before waving his hand dismissively and signaling the plow to keep going. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't an accident. It was a decision. My land, apparently, was convenient, out of sight, and not protected by HOA membership, which in their minds made it disposable. Over the next few hours, the snowbanks grew taller and heavier, creeping closer to my fence line, blocking access paths, crushing low shrubs, and compacting into thick, icy slabs that would take weeks to melt. And as I documented everything with photos and video, the frustration simmered into something sharper, because I knew enough about drainage land, grading, and winter runoff to understand what this would cause once temperatures fluctuated, and it wouldn't be pretty. When I contacted the HOA office that afternoon, I was met with the usual passive tone, kind that sounds polite but carries zero accountability. As the property manager calmly informed me that snow storage during emergencies fell under temporary operational necessity, and that since my property was adjacent to HOA infrastructure, they had assumed cooperation, a phrase that landed like an insult, because no one had asked, no agreement existed, and the damage was already done. I made it clear that I did not consent, that my land was not common space, and that continued dumping would result in liability. But the response was a rehearsed assurance that the situation would be reviewed, which experience had taught me meant ignored until I either gave up or escalated. Over the next week, storm after storm rolled through, and each time more snow was pushed onto my land, packed tighter, higher, and farther inward, until it resembled a man-made glacier pressed against my boundary, and with each dump, my access routes narrowed, my soil compacted, and the natural slope that directed meltwater away from structures was slowly reshaped by thousands of pounds of frozen mass. And I knew exactly what would happen when that ice began to thaw. The water would flow downhill, straight toward the HOA street they were so desperate to keep pristine. I sent certified letters, formal notices, and even a survey map highlighting property lines, but none of it slowed them down, because the HOA board saw winter snow as a short-term inconvenience, not a long-term consequence, and they assumed wrongly that I would eventually cave, or that nature would quietly clean up their mess. What they didn't realize was that by dumping their snow on my land, they had also dumped responsibility into my hands, and I was no longer willing to absorb the cost, the damage, or the disrespect. The final straw came when a plow operator, following direct instructions from the HOA, breached the edge of my gravel drive, burying it under a solid wall of ice that hardened overnight, effectively cutting off vehicle access and forcing me to park half a mile away. And when I contacted the HOA again, the response was colder than the storm itself. A board member telling me bluntly that winter operations take priority over individual inconvenience, a statement that confirmed they saw me not as a neighbor but as an obstacle. That night, standing at the edge of my property under the glow of a streetlight reflecting off frozen snowbanks, I stopped thinking about complaints and started thinking about physics, drainage laws, and the simple truth that snow once placed on private land belongs to the landowner, and if they were going to treat my property like a dumping ground, then I would treat their street like the downstream. It's a consequence of their own decisions, because winter wasn't over yet, and neither was I. After a few days of watching the HOA's negligence pile up in the form of frozen mountains on my property, I realized that passive resistance, polite emails, and certified letters weren't going to accomplish anything. The more I tried to appeal to their sense of decency or reason, the more I understood that their mindset was simple and unyielding. Convenience for themselves came first. Legality and courtesy were negotiable, and I was simply a boundary to be ignored, and so I started thinking strategically, mapping out the flow of snow and water. Considering the topography of my land and the adjacent streets, calculating how gravity, temperature fluctuations, and meltwater would behave if I simply let nature follow its course, but I also knew that passive waiting would only cause more damage to my property. So the idea emerged to turn the situation into leverage, to make the consequences of their actions undeniable, immediate, and highly inconvenient for them. Because the truth is that when people like my HOA finally see the real-world effect of their disregard, they panic, they scramble, and they regret the decisions they thought were minor or justified. And the beauty of the plan was that it required no illegal action, no destruction, only careful, intelligent use of the winter conditions they had already created, which meant that the snow they dumped became a tool rather than an obstacle. And from that moment on, I began documenting the precise locations, weights, and volumes of each snow deposit, noting the slope angles, measuring the runoff paths, and even using simple physics formulas to predict how and where the water would move once thawing began. Because knowledge, I realized, was the ultimate weapon in this war of negligence, and preparation was everything. Over the next several days, I acted as both observer and engineer, marking boundaries with stakes, creating makeshift channels to direct excess meltwater, and taking hundreds of photographs at multiple times of day to capture the exact dimensions and placements of each snowbank, because if this escalated to legal or insurance disputes, evidence would be my shield. And meanwhile, I began quietly clearing access points to ensure that I could implement my plan efficiently, moving smaller amounts of snow to precise locations to subtly shape the larger masses without attracting attention. A painstaking process that required patience, timing, and coordination with weather forecasts, because any miscalculation in temperature, sunlight exposure, or runoff could either neutralize the effect or cause collateral damage. And I was determined that the result would be exactly targeted toward the HOS street, and only toward the areas they had claimed to manage so confidently. Which meant that every snow mound, every ice ridge, every temporary barrier I constructed had a purpose, like a carefully designed chessboard in which the pawns were frozen and the opponent was oblivious to the game being played. On the morning I began the more active phase of my plan, the sky was gray, the air biting, and the neighborhood all was alive with the typical sounds of winter. Loud scraping vehicles crunching over ice, neighbors complaining about blocked driveways, and children laughing in the snow. And I moved deliberately, dragging smaller piles of snow from the far edges of my property to the perimeter of the street where HOA trucks regularly passed, creating a subtle but firm blockade that was obvious at first glance, but would grow with every thaw cycle. Because I knew that the combination of temperature, sun exposure, and compacted snow would cause the barriers to expand slightly, shift, and ultimately merge into a wall that was impossible to ignore. A process that required careful attention, multiple trips, and constant adjustment as I monitored snow density, temperature readings, and even wind direction to ensure that the snow moved exactly where I wanted it to go, and not toward neighboring properties, because collateral impact would only weaken my position morally and legally. While the HOA continued their routine operations, oblivious to my slow engineering, I began notifying a few trusted neighbors of what I was observing, framing it as a natural winter experiment rather than a deliberate action. Because I didn't want witnesses who might misinterpret intent, but wanted allies in case questions arose. And the reactions I received were surprisingly supportive. Some shared their own stories of mismanaged snow, others marveled at my methodical approach, and a few warned me to be careful. But I reassured them that every action was legal, strategic, and defensive in nature, and that no property damage or safety hazard was being created beyond what the HOA had already imposed on me. Because this was not about revenge in the petty sense. It was about correcting an imbalance of responsibility and making them face consequences in a controlled, precise manner. By midweek, the street in question had become subtly compromised. Snow along the edges was forming ridges. Slight dips were channeling runoff into areas where compacted ice would cause slippage and small accumulations. Water were pooling in low spots, all according to my calculations, and I continued monitoring, adjusting, and recording because this was only the beginning, the prelude to the moment when the HOA would finally recognize that their careless snow dumping had a direct and unavoidable impact. And they would have no choice but to respond not with the same polite reassurances, but with real, tangible action to correct the problem they had created, and that moment when it came would be entirely of my own careful design because patience, planning, and the disciplined application of natural forces were far more effective than shouting, pleading, or filing endless complaints. Meanwhile, internally, I maintained a calm, almost meditative mindset, because the thrill of strategy, the satisfaction of precise control over a chaotic situation, and the anticipation of inevitable HOA panic replaced the initial anger with something more focused and productive. A sense of empowerment that comes from realizing that when others overstep their bounds, one doesn't have to submit quietly, but can instead turn circumstances into a lever, a tool, and ultimately a lesson for the oblivious. And every photograph, every measurement, every shifted snow mound became part of a narrative I would control, not just for myself, but for the record. And I relished the growing inevitability that their winter arrogance would soon collide with physics, responsibility, and my patient preparation. And that collision would be loud, undeniable, and above all, entirely fair. By the time the weekend arrived, the weather forecast predicted a light thaw combined with additional snowfall, which was perfect. The new snow would blend with the barriers I had shaped, increase mass, and accelerate the compaction process, ensuring that once temperatures rose above freezing, the runoff would be channeled exactly toward the street's low points where HOA trucks had previously caused the most intrusion onto my land. And I made final adjustments, moving small ridges, leveling minor dips, and documenting everything one last time before stepping back to watch and wait, because the most critical phase of my plan was now in the hands of gravity, temperature, and time, and I knew from careful calculations that once the thaw began, the HOA would be forced into action they couldn't ignore, and that the lessons of negligence, entitlement, and lack of respect for private property would finally be driven home in a way they would remember for the rest of the season. And perhaps longer. By midweek, the temperature began its subtle climb above freezing, the gray skies breaking occasionally to reveal weak winter sunlight, and as the ice and snow began to soften, compacted walls that had been meticulously placed along the edge of my property started to shift imperceptibly, minute movements that I had calculated weeks earlier. But that would appear chaotic to anyone observing. Without context, and as the first runoff trickled down the channels I had engineered, it became immediately clear that the street bordering my land, the very same street that had been cleared with ruthless efficiency while my property was treated like a dumping ground, was about to feel the full consequence of the HOA's disregard, because gravity, mass, and precise placement had combined to create a natural blockade that began redirecting the melting snow toward the road, pooling water in low spots where the asphalt had subtle depressions, and soon enough these depressions started to freeze again overnight, creating patches of black ice that were almost invisible in the dim morning light, a direct product of their own previous negligence. And when HOA maintenance crews arrived the next day, they were met with the first unmistakable signs of disruption: vehicles sliding slightly, snow melting into icy channels at inconvenient points, and snow ridges that were no longer simple barriers but hardened, shifting walls that resisted plows, making every attempt to clear the road slower and more difficult than anyone anticipated. And as I observed from my property line, taking careful notes and photos, I could see the confusion on the drivers' faces, the tension in the crew leaders' body language, and the frantic calls being made to the HOA office, which finally began to grasp that the situation was far from routine, far from temporary. and entirely out of their control, all of it originating from the exact location they had assumed would absorb inconvenience without complaint. What followed over the next several days was a ballet of escalating panic. The HOA board members began holding emergency calls and meetings. The property manager repeatedly called me under the guise of cooperative discussion, but it was clear that their words carried no authority over the physical reality unfolding outside, because snow and water, once placed with precision, do not respond to polite requests or reassurances, and as the thaw progressed, water began to seep into shallow spots in the street, saturating cracks and forming small rivulets that fed into larger icy accumulations overnight, creating a subtle but unyielding barricade that left trucks spinning their tires. Residents cautiously navigating, and the HOA scrambling to respond with shovels, sand and salt that seemed increasingly ineffective against the engineered combination of frozen mass and flowing water. And the psychological effect was immediate. The same authority they wielded so confidently before now seemed fragile, disorganized, and reactive, and their panic grew in proportion to the precision and inevitability of my plan. Meanwhile, my own property remained entirely unaffected, because every channel, ridge, and ice wall I had constructed had been positioned to contain the thaw on my land, directing it outward toward the street while leaving my access paths, foundation, and landscape intact, testament to careful planning, patience, and an intimate understanding of natural forces. And I watched the unfolding scene with a mix of satisfaction and detached curiosity, noting how quickly those who had dismissed my rights as a property owner were now confronting the consequences of their choices, all while I maintained the high ground legally, morally, and physically, because every action taken was within my rights, measured, and completely defensible. The turning point came one afternoon when a particularly warm gust of wind, combined with several days of partial sunlight, caused a surge of meltwater to flood one of the HOA street's lowest points. And for the first time, trucks became immobilized in a shallow but firm puddle, slipping and sliding as drivers attempted to move the vehicles, the scene escalating to a point where multiple maintenance personnel were required just to free one vehicle. And by the time the board members arrived to witness this firsthand, their collective expression of disbelief was unmistakable. They had underestimated both the power of winter, natural forces, and my ability to manipulate them responsibly, but effectively and suddenly. The polite facade of administrative control shattered into frantic discussions, emergency meeting calls, and angry phone calls to contractors, all aimed at addressing a problem they had themselves created but were powerless to resolve quickly. During this chaos, residents began noticing the unusual buildup on their street as well. Minor detours were created by snow and ice mounds that had shifted overnight. Cars were forced to slow to a crawl, and conversations between neighbors included phrases like, "Did the HOA mess this up again? I don't know why they can't handle snow like everyone else." And while these murmurs of discontent spread through the community, I remained unobtrusive, documenting each development, because evidence, timing, and precision were my allies in this unfolding narrative. In the moral clarity of my actions, protecting my property while allowing the consequences of others' negligence to manifest was something I carried with unwavering confidence. By the end of the week, the street was effectively impassable in several key areas. Snow ridges had merged into near-continuous barriers. Runoff had pooled into icy patches, and the vehicles attempting to navigate the area were encountering delays that would have been laughable if they were in. Tease so revealing, because every inch of difficulty was a direct, an inevitable result of the HOA's own decisions weeks prior, when they had chosen convenience over legality and assumed my silence. And now the panic became palpable in their board communications, which I intercepted legally through neighbor reporting and public HOA meeting notes. They were openly debating emergency contractors, temporary closures, and legal strategies, all while residents expressed irritation at their sudden lack of competence. And in every instance, the disruption could be traced back to my meticulously calculated placement and channeling of snow and ice, demonstrating that patience, precision, and understanding of natural forces could achieve more than forceful confrontation ever could, and that the arrogance of leadership, when paired with negligence, would always meet the consequences eventually. In private, I reflected on the unfolding situation with a sense of satisfaction that extended beyond simple revenge. This was a demonstration, a lesson in accountability, and a validation of meticulous planning. And while the board panicked and residents debated, I remained calm, collected, prepared for any escalation, because every action I had taken was deliberate, every variable accounted for, and every potential outcome anticipated. And as the weekend approached, it became increasingly clear that the HOA's perception of winter operations as trivial and temporary was utterly flawed, because the natural forces they had underestimated were now exacting consequences on a scale they could neither ignore nor swiftly resolve. And the irony of the situation, self-inflicted chaos caused by their own hand, all while my property remained safe, was not lost on me, nor would it be lost on anyone who witnessed the unfolding results. As the weekend unfolded, the situation reached its peak intensity. The culmination of weeks of careful observation, precise engineering, and the inevitable interplay of gravity, meltwater, and compacted snow. And by Saturday morning, the HOA street was effectively transformed from a routine winter thoroughfare into a frozen, partially flooded obstacle course that rendered their prior assumptions of control absurd, because every plow, every truck, and every maintenance attempt was now slowed, redirected, or partially immobilized by the exact measures I had implemented, all without a single action that could be deemed illegal, reckless, or unsafe. And as board members arrived on site, their faces bore the unmistakable signs of panic, frustration, and disbelief, because they were confronting the physical reality of consequences they had ignored for too long. And the residents, for their part, were both bemused and sympathetic, whispering among themselves about how finally, after weeks of mismanagement and arrogance, the HOA was facing a challenge they could not instantly solve. Spectacle that validated the principle that actions, especially negligent ones, carry tangible repercussions. And I observed all of this from the edge of my property with a sense of calm satisfaction, knowing that patience, planning, and adherence to the law had allowed me to turn an untenable situation into a clear demonstration of accountability. By mid-morning, as temperatures fluctuated and sunlight softened certain ice patches, while compacted snow resisted easy movement, the HOA attempted more aggressive interventions. Emergency contractors were called, additional plows were deployed, and manual shoveling began in earnest. But each effort only highlighted the foresight of my preparations, because the meltwater channels I had designed amplified their difficulties. Rerouting the runoff, refreezing at critical points, and producing conditions that required constant adjustment and oversight. And the frustration of the crews became evident as trucks spun tires. Tools were misplaced, and coordination broke down, illustrating a simple truth that they had previously ignored: infrastructure. Even a small neighborhood street is only as effective as the planning, respect for property, and consideration for natural forces behind it. And any disruption, if precisely engineered, cannot be countered by mere urgency, panic, or authority. The board members convened an emergency meeting on the street itself, huddling around clipboards, phones, and temp data while muttering over their inability to restore order quickly. And it was in that moment, watching from a distance, that the full satisfaction of the effort became apparent. Because their claims of operational priority, efficiency, and winter management were now contradicted by irrefutable evidence that misjudgment and negligence had tangible, immediate consequences. And I had not only predicted these outcomes, but orchestrated the conditions so that the results were unavoidable, yet entirely within legal and ethical boundaries. A perfect balance of defense, deterrence, and consequence. Meanwhile, residents began to appreciate the spectacle in real time. Parents slowed their children sledding to observe the shifting snow ridges, drivers took longer routes around the street, and neighbors casually discussed the snow siege with amusement, admiration, and a sense of communal recognition that those who act irresponsibly eventually face repercussions. And the HOA, for their part, scrambled, reevaluating their winter management strategies, calling for additional resources, and even publicly acknowledging the unique challenge posed by what they now referred to as unexpected conditions. Never once realizing that these conditions were entirely of their own making, carefully guided and anticipated by a single undetermined property owner who refused to accept continued infringement. Over the following days, as temperatures normalized and the snow continued to melt gradually, the once problematic street slowly cleared, revealing a clear, undeniable pattern. The areas of most difficulty, the pools, the icy patches, and the stubborn ridges all corresponded exactly with the points where their dumping practices had intruded onto my land. A living map of cause and effect that they could neither erase nor contest without acknowledging fault. And this evidence, combined with my documentation photos, videos, timestamps, and detailed records, ensured that any attempts to claim the events were coincidental or weather-driven would be untenable. Because the precision, placement, and timing of the disruption could only be explained by deliberate, calculated engineering, and that realization seemed to dawn slowly on several board members over cups of coffee in the subsequent meetings. Where previously unflappable administrators now appeared tense, defensive, and remarkably quieter than usual, a stark contrast to the confident assertions made weeks earlier when they assumed that my objections were inconsequential, and that my property could serve as a snow repository without consequence. In private reflection, I recognized that while the events had been personally satisfying, the greater outcome was systemic. The HOA had been forced to confront the limitations of authority untempered by accountability, and the neighborhood had witnessed firsthand that natural forces, plied with knowledge and patience, could correct imbalances created by negligence and for my neighbors. This became a subtle lesson in property rights responsibility and the sometimes underestimated power of calculated non-confrontational resistance, because no laws were broken, no safety was endangered, and yet a message had been delivered with clarity and impact, one that could not be ignored or dismissed without acknowledging the truth. By the end of the season, the snow had completely melted, the street had been repaired, and the HOA, wary now and more cautious in its winter management, avoided similar actions in the future. While I, having documented every moment, every photograph, and every calculated adjustment, retained full control over the narrative, legal protection in case of disputes, and a quiet sense of victory that stemmed not from malice but from reason, planning, and principled response. And as the neighborhood returned to normal, with residents clearing their own driveways, children building snowmen, and vehicles traveling freely, I felt the profound satisfaction of having demonstrated, without confrontation, that respect for boundaries, consideration for others, and patience combined with foresight were more powerful than arrogance, negligence, or assumed authority, and that sometimes the best response to repeated provocation is a measured, intelligent strategy that allows consequences to speak louder than words, because in the end, nature and law aligned perfectly with my efforts to remind those who overstep that responsibility is unavoidable, that patience has power, and that winter, when guided with precision, could become an instrument of accountability and justice in its most subtle, effective, and unforgettable form.